Okay, I think we are on. Very good. So good afternoon. Thank you, Professor. Welcome to another Lisbon Speed Talk. During the next 30 minutes, we'll be talking about how to save democracy from technology. On behalf of the Clube de Lisboa, I would like to thank everyone who is watching us, and in particular, thank Professor Barak Richman. Professor Richman is a professor of law and business administration at Duke University. His primary research interests include economics of contracting, new institutional economics, antitrust, and healthcare policy. His book, Stateless Commerce, was published at Harvard University Press 3 years ago, and last year he was a visiting scholar at the Stanford University School of Medicine and also a member of the Stanford's program on democracy and the internet. Professor Richman just published an article at the Foreign Affairs magazine with his colleagues Ashish Goel and Fukuyama. The article is called How to Save Democracy from Technology, and the subtitle is Ending Big Tech's Information Monopoly. So we have two big, clear ideas already in the title and the subtitle. Before I give the floor to our guest, a quick logistical note. Professor Richman will make an initial 10 minutes intervention, followed by your questions, the questions of the audience. They can be both posed in Portuguese or English. You have the column on your right, on the right of the screen to write them. So if you want to make a comment or a question, that's the place. You can either do it on Facebook or YouTube. So we now have, I would say, 29 minutes for this speak talk. So I give the floor to Professor Richman. Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to the Lisbon Club. I should say very briefly that I really hope that I can do this again in person. I've been to Lisbon a couple of times as a visiting professor at Católica University. I love the city, I love the country, and I look forward to visiting again. So the title of this talk, I guess, is called Technology and Democracy, Friends or Foes? And maybe the summary of my answer is, right now, there are elements where democracy and technology are foes, but we have a proposal where they can be friends again. So I came to Stanford in part as a visitor to work on a project that tried to examine the threats and the dangers, but also the possibilities, the benefits of the large platforms, specifically Google and Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Apple, perhaps even Microsoft, although Microsoft is less of an informational platform. I came to this project as an expert in antitrust law or competition law. And the concern, of course, is that these are entities that have a lot of economic power. They are monopolists in certain markets and are causing economic harm in a number of different market segments. That was the premise of the project. It is quite possible, although a lot of facts still need to be unearthed, it's quite possible that, in fact, the premise behind that project is true, that a lot of these companies are monopolists, or in European parlance, enjoy a dominant position. And it's quite possible that they are acting as illegal monopolists, and they are abusing a dominant position, and they are violating the competition laws both in Europe and the United States. And it's possible that appropriate antitrust lawsuits can and should be brought against them. That's entirely possible. But what our project uncovered, the more we dug into the details, the more we spoke to different stakeholders, is that in addition to, or aside from the economic dangers that these large companies have, there are distinctly political dangers as well that really cannot be addressed through Articles 81 and 82 of the Treaty of Rome and through the American Sherman Act and the antitrust laws. And that these political dangers are at least as significant and really require a very focused intervention. So what are these political concerns? Well, perhaps there is no greater illustration of those political concerns than what happened in the United States after January 6th. Now, in the United States, if you say the date January 6th, everybody knows exactly what you're talking about. January 6th is when a number of supporters of former President Trump stormed the Capitol building, tried to stop a democratic process, a process of counting and verifying the results of the national election. You could easily call it a coup, an insurrection. And in response to that, to the event of January 6th, Twitter and Facebook disabled Donald Trump's accounts. Now, it could easily be argued, and I would find this argument compelling, that that was the right thing to do, that Donald Trump was using these accounts as in ways that were posing a clear and present danger to the nation and to the economy and to, especially to the democracy. But it's quite striking that a private company can silence a United States president. And many people, including Alexei Navalny, raise this concern that just as Twitter and Facebook could silence a United States president, they much more easily could silence champions of democracy. So that illustrates our primary concern, which we articulated in our Foreign Affairs article that preceded January 6th. And our primary concern is that these platforms contain an enormous amount of power that can be wielded for political purposes. They could shape elections, they could shape policy outcomes, they certainly can shape regulations and laws that are affected to them. But they also can really move public opinion in ways that that are antithetical and damaging to the very core of a liberal democracy. So what is to be done about that? What is to be done about these new sources of political power, not just economic power, they certainly have economic power, but political power, the ability to shift public opinion and to control public discourse and to silence some important political actors and to give microphones or megaphones to other political actors. We really had to understand what was at the source of this political power, and we tried to develop possible alternatives, possible remedies to rectify it. And at the core of what we find so troubling is this notion of algorithms that spread speech. Twitter, Facebook, Google, Amazon also, although less in the political realm, all of them involve algorithms that we cannot see. Certainly users cannot see and regulators cannot see also. And these algorithms are used to advance certain perspectives. Sometimes it's trying to appeal to what they think the user would want, but often, and it could be used in ways that they think that the executives want to advance. These algorithms are used to amplify certain voices and to quiet others. And they are unobservable, they're unmonitorable, they're not transparent, and it's not clear that they have been used to manipulate democracy, but it is unquestionable that they could be used to manipulate democracy and result in and change electoral outcomes. And not only could the platforms be manipulated by their owners, by the executives, but they also could be controlled by nefarious actors, by foreign actors who have learned how to manipulate the algorithms. At the core of this power, not only are algorithms that shift and control political discourse writ large, but also is this focus on virality. It's a business model that encourages widespread clicks. That is their business model. That is how these platforms generate revenue, advertising revenue. So if you have algorithms that amplify certain voices that are built upon a business model that encourages virality, then you have a platform that really can shift public opinion in a very forceful way. And this is all a product of their size, of their scale. So how do we address that? How do we address the core of their political power? Well, we have introduced and proposed what we call middleware. It's a technological solution. And what this would do is it would allow users to choose their own algorithm. Instead of algorithms being selected by the company managers or perhaps being manipulated by nefarious third parties, we want individuals to be able to download algorithms that are promoted by trusted sources. It could be your local school district, it could be a school of journalism, it could be your local university. It could be a news source or a political organization or a civic organization that you really trust. And these organizations would promote and advance algorithms that filter your results. They can organize your news feed. They can order your search results. They can manage your Twitter feed. These are algorithms that we would select ourselves, and therefore we would have more control over the kind of news and the kind of influence that we receive. But more importantly, this would decentralize the number of algorithms out there. It would diversify the algorithms that are out there. And this would alleviate, significantly dilute the control that the platforms themselves have over the kinds of information that people receive. Now, technologically, this would not be terribly difficult. This would require some regulation, but it would require forcing the main platforms, specifically we're thinking of Google, Facebook, and Twitter, but certainly Amazon and Apple would work also, especially now that Apple is increasingly getting into news and news feeds. It would require that they open up their APIs and allow add-ons. Now this, basic plugins. Now this would not change the kinds of services that the platforms would offer. This would not dilute the value that they serve. And in fact, it would also not disintermediate their connection with users. All it would do is would mean that individuals have greater control over the algorithms that influence their user experience so much. And in allowing a competitive layer of middleware and allowing lots of individuals to control the algorithms that determine what news they get, what information they have, we have directly addressed this new form concentrated political power. We have diversified it. Now, this doesn't solve all of the problems that we have in the internet. It does not necessarily address the economic challenges that we have with the platforms. They still might maintain economic power and therefore be subject to antitrust enforcement even after the introduction of middleware. This certainly does not solve the problem of political extremism. This does not remove people from their political bubbles, but it does mean that people who are in political bubbles no longer have the megaphone that helps amplify and spread their political views onto the mainstream political discourse. And it also means that we have more control over the kinds of news and the kinds of experiences we have over the internet. It really restores a certain kind of autonomy that individuals we think are losing in this political moment. So that's our idea, that's our diagnosis of not the problem, but a significant problem. That's our remedy that we propose, and that is how we think that even though technology and democracy are at loggerheads, are at a moment of great tension right now, we have proposed a technological solution that we think really can shore up democracy at this moment of angst.
Very good. If I may ask you a few questions before we have questions from the audience, it seems to me that that there is a practical problem with your idea, which is it requires that people have digital literacy, not to say computers. We now face a problem with the classes, with the kids in classes in Portugal and all the rest of Europe, not to mention Africa and other and poor countries, with the problem of families without computers or without digital abilities. So, I mean, how would you? I mean, this idea requires both, doesn't it?
Well, to a large degree, the problem we have now exists, and not just in developed nations, certainly in lower income nations. The problem we have exists because technology is so pervasive. There were very alarming reports that social media nefarious actors were trying to use social media to affect elections in places like Sri Lanka and political actions in Myanmar. So this is not just a developed nation problem. And social media, the influence of these digital communication harms is spreading throughout the world and every place where there is a democracy. Now, so in that sense, the problem is created because of the pervasiveness of digital technologies already. Now, your first question is quite important. Does this require, our solution, our remedy, require some kind of digital literacy in order to implement? And it might require some, but not a lot. It would not be difficult to install middleware onto any of these platforms. It's nothing more than using a drop-down menu once you're on the platform. Now, it is possible that even though it is available, not many people will use it, and people will simply keep the algorithm that the company offers as a default, and that would be a real problem. We'd have to make sure that that's not the default. We might, in fact, actually have to force individuals to choose. This is just simply worrying about digital inertia.
Because one thing is to passively access to your mobile and see what your friends are saying in Sri Lanka, and that's that we know that it's the problems are very similar in terms of trying to influence big audiences. Another thing is to go, as you said, to find these new gatekeepers, right? If I understand well, and ask them or elect them as our new gatekeepers. Is that what you're saying? And find our own algorithm so that we are not inside of the bubble. So that's more. I mean, it's a lot of action, very different from just being at the sofa reading Instagram and Facebook and all the silly stuff that comes to our feeds, right?
So, so it does require more action than that, for sure. It does require some kind of proactive relationship with the platforms, which really is quite important anyway. It is part of the civic education that I think we need to give everybody. But this role of intermediaries that you bring up is really interesting. You call them gatekeepers. I might call them a part of civic society, part of our community institutions. We as social animals need to be part of civic organizations, whether it's religious organizations or educational or neighborhood organizations. And part of the real harm that our virtual world, our world of our social networks has imposed upon us is that it's diluted those. We are now individuals. We're a miasma of individuals in our digital world, and we're not connected to organizations, to institutions that are really important to us. And you might say that in this digital world, we really need those civic organizations to step up. For example, if I'm part of Duke University as a community, as a living and working community, has done all sorts of things to make sure that we take care of each other. This would be one other thing that Duke University would do. It would develop middleware, and again, technologically it wouldn't be that complicated, but it would say to its members, we are really trying to mobilize ourselves against the dangers of the digital world. Here's a source of middleware that we think would be very helpful, that would emphasize accurate sources, that would focus on important political issues. And we as a community need to mobilize against that. I think that these are not gatekeepers. These are community institutions that need to step up, that we need to guide us in this new political moment.
So in practical terms, how would that work? I mean, if you could make a more simple kind of drawing. Imagine a strong community or neighborhood near you in California, where, well, you don't have much Trump supporters compared to other states, but imagine the a place in California where you have a high level of Trump supporters. What would they have to do using the middleware strategy to come out of that, to break the bubble in which they are?
Yeah, so I mean, again, we're not trying to break bubbles. As long as people want to be in bubbles and people want to exchange ideas within bubbles, that's an idea that is thoroughly protected by the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. And, like it or not, the dissemination and sharing of ideas that we disagree with is an important part of democracy. Mm-hmm. What we are really worried about is one particular bubble growing and eating up all of the other ones, if we're using the metaphor. If we think about how this would work in where we are in California, this is how it would work. Again, technologically, this is not complicated. The platforms would open up their APIs and in a very rudimentary way would allow organizations to set up middleware that would change the algorithms. So I could easily imagine my family downloading an algorithm that was created by our local school district, the San Mateo County School District. And what would that algorithm do? Well, if it were a Google algorithm, what we would do is when we would search for news, or if we're on Facebook and we were getting news feeds, it would emphasize local news. It would talk about the kind of challenges that our local community leaders and our local politicians are, for example, trying to employ to combat the coronavirus. It would talk about local inequality. It would talk about local businesses. As it turns out, we all know that the digital world has really hurt the coverage of local news, which in turn has hurt the strength and the accountability of local government. This would be a way for us to tell the internet what's important to us. And, there are lots of school districts in California that do not share the political views of Menlo Park. There are a lot of school districts that share the views of President Trump. They might come up with their own algorithm that would be different, certainly on national news, but they also might emphasize local news. And that would help communities everywhere. It would re-emphasize what we think our priorities are, and it would be reflected in the news feeds we get in Google, the news feeds we get in Facebook, even the exchanges we have on Twitter.
We have a member of the audience asking how could these middleware systems prevent the manipulation of public opinion?
Yeah, the key idea here is that instead of one algorithm governing Twitter, you have thousands and thousands of algorithms. So it is possible that Russian hackers could figure out what the San Mateo School District algorithm is doing and manipulate us here in San Mateo County, but they would not influence the nation and national discourse. That is central. Instead of having one algorithm that either the executives at Twitter or the FSB in Russia could manipulate, you have a decentralized internet. And therefore, you don't have the kind of control over national or even international political discourse that you have when you only have a common algorithm.
Mm-hmm. And what about applying these not only to politics, another person asks, but to products, to the stuff we buy?
Exactly. You could easily introduce algorithms onto Amazon. When we search for a product in Amazon, coffee mugs or whatever, we get a listing that Amazon controls. And Amazon sequences its listing based on a variety of things, including, frankly, trying to promote Amazon's high margin products. I could easily imagine algorithms that instead prioritize local manufacturers or emphasize green, eco-friendly products. we very easily, and this would also apply to Google Shopping, it could apply to all sorts of, it could apply to Etsy, it could apply to lots of other platforms where if you are searching for products, we could control the kind of listings and the kind of rank priorities that we get when we're looking for shopping. And that would reflect our political values also.
Mm-hmm. One thing that is much talked about is the one of the problems to move on is with us, with the citizens, not just the governments or the difficulty in facing the big tax, but because it's comfortable. So we know we are, many of us or many of the citizens already have some distrust towards the big companies. We all know that they pose a threat. We have seen the results, we have seen the news, we have seen the manipulation on elections, but it's more comfortable to say yes to the cookies, and just not to change our behavior. So it seems that people, even though they know about it, they don't feel it's a real threat.
Well, that in fact is why it is a much greater threat than we realize. You know, we live in a world of disinformation. If we're watching television, it is very easy for us to change the channel. That's just part of how we're hardwired. If we don't like what we're getting, we can change the channel. Now, that leads to filter bubbles, that leads to echo chambers. That's not without harm. But at the very least, it is part of how we naturally engage with that medium. In the digital world, they manipulate us. We are constantly checking our phones. We're constantly attracted to the most outrageous sources of news. They have figured out ways to manipulate our attention. And for those reasons, it's much harder to metaphorically change the channel. We are tied to the feeds that we have. And that's really why it is so important to come up with a concentrated way, a concerted way, to unlock these algorithms and make sure that there are more available. There is something very pernicious, very subtle, very manipulative about the entire interface. And that's really different from other sources of news. And that's why a concentrated remedy is required.
Another viewer asks, whether do you believe that these big companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, will buy your ideas? So the middleware strategy.
Well, you know, so let's put it this way. Facebook and Twitter have come under enormous criticism for making decisions that they were forced to make. You either have Donald Trump on your platform or you don't. And I think both Facebook and Twitter would prefer not to make that decision at all. They get criticized no matter what they do. For that reason, I think they would welcome, and we have heard from executives in Silicon Valley this very argument, they would welcome the ability to rid themselves of that decision. And Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter himself, has said, ultimately, we want to go to a world where everybody can choose their own algorithm. We think that this kind of decentralization, it might dilute the company's political power, it might even dilute some of their economic power, but it would allow them ultimately to be able to focus on what they want to do. It would make their platforms a lot more attractive and therefore perhaps even more valuable. And ultimately, it's a lot better than some other political alternatives that we've been discussing. So we think that they would welcome a lot of what we've been proposing. And would they, in welcoming what we propose, would they effectively be co-opting what we propose? Would they, instead of our local school districts, be offering the algorithms that we can choose from? Well, they might, but we have to make sure that they don't. And once they open up their APIs to multiple algorithms, we really need to make sure that civic society and other organizations step up, and we would really need to make sure that we really do have control over the algorithm that we select.
What would be the next, the following?
But we also think that it's something that we would have to make sure they don't manipulate.
What would be the following steps? Would you go through the Congress, or would you start a more formal national conversation? I mean, what's your plan?
Well, our current plan would require some kind of legislation from Congress. But that's not the only plan that we could pursue. So plan A, you might say, is really making sure that as a national and international matter, the platforms open up their APIs and welcome middleware providers. But even in the current moment, there have been a lot of companies that have reached out to us and said, hey, we are actually doing middleware things. We are working, for example, with Google's API, and we are allowing Google News searches to include our endorsements of some news sources, but not others. We've talked with some companies who have used Twitter's APIs to try to tailor web searches. Now, this is mostly happening because the platforms, in an individual sense, in a small sense, are cooperating with individual vendors and individual companies. And that could continue. And that could continue without Congress. That could happen on a voluntary basis with the platforms, and perhaps it could happen on a much larger scale. But what we envision, if we really are to attack the core of this source of political power, would really require some national and international intervention. So we can imagine smaller interventions happening more voluntarily, perhaps happening on a more focused level, but we ultimately think that our plan would require new legislation from Congress.
Mm-hmm. Another viewer is asking, what about the risk of these new trusted companies from whom we would buy our new middleware? What if they follow a personal agenda, a hidden agenda, and then we go into the same problem, but just in micro, I guess, a multiple micro level?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the best answer to that, it would be at a micro level. For sure, there are going to be middleware providers that have agendas. In fact, actually, that's part of the purpose. You could imagine a school of journalism having an agenda saying we only want to support good journalism. You could also imagine a political organization with either an extreme left-wing perspective or an extreme right-wing perspective saying we want to use these algorithms to only promote our own news for our own agendas. Well, that would be okay because the users would voluntarily select those algorithms. The real danger would be if all of a sudden everybody selected a common middleware provider. That would really repeat the problem that we're in.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, this is a speed talk. It's 5:37, so 30 minutes have gone. I thank you very, very much. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you so much for having me. We know, we believe that what we're doing, what we're addressing is an international problem. We certainly know that these platforms have gone global, and every country has its own regulatory system, and we'll have to confront these common challenges in very different ways. I look forward, if possible, to continuing to have this conversation as it particularly relates to different polities. And I will also say, though, that I'll say the obvious, which is this is a moment that is very fraught for liberal democracies. We have all learned, if we didn't know it already, that democracy is very fragile. And it's important to figure out which institutions we really need to bolster in order to make sure that democracies can flourish. So I look forward to that kind of international collaboration.
Very good. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, and good luck with your diligence. Thank you.